Welcome to the Bend Don't Break podcast. I'm Aaron Schweitzer, your host, along with Central Oregon's most electrifying reporter, Laurel Bronze. This podcast is powered by the Source Weekly, Bend's locally owned newspaper. Our guest today is Tod Heisler, Rivers Conservation Director for Central Oregon LandWatch. Tod grew up on a river outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. He is an economics major at Colby College in Waterville, Maryland. Is that it, Tod?
Maine.
ME got me. And began working in conservation from the business side. Worked in DC for 22 years for the World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International. Worked for the Deschutes River Conservancy for 15 years, where he concentrated on restoring flows to the Deschutes River. We wanted to have Tod on our podcast this week because while the election is garnering everyone's attention, there are still other important issues moving forward. One of which centers around the Deschutes Basin Habitat Conservation Plan, which will be released in November. However, before we dive into that, Tod, maybe give us a little background. Why did you become interested in conservation?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for having me on today. It's a real pleasure to be part of your podcast. And
Thanks.
This is going to be a lot of fun. So I grew up on a river, as you mentioned, in Ohio, but very young age, got involved in whitewater paddling and hiking, backpacking. By the age of 20, I had done a major expedition in Alaska and 3 weeks in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which of course the Trump administration is attacking these days to drill on the coastal plain, which has the largest migration of wildlife in North America, the porcupine herd of caribou, which we got to see among many other things at the age of 20. So I think that really launched me kind of physically and spiritually into protecting our natural resources and our environment. And I've been fortunate enough all this time to be able to work in the field.
And you spent some formative years in Washington, D.C., getting up close on environmental politics. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, surprisingly, I didn't learn too much about domestic politics because I worked for 2 international organizations. So what I did learn about conservation in that regard, though, what was so very different from domestic politics is when you do conservation work or try to do conservation work in other countries, you can't just show up and, with an attitude and say, we're going to protect your forests and we're going to save all these things. So sort of by the very nature of the business, it has to be pretty collaborative and you have to work, we call it kind of at the grassroots level out in the villages where the people are, but also in the capital cities with the politicians. And ultimately, you were trying to make an argument to less developed countries that you can sustainably manage your resources while protecting them. And protection of those resources is a very important thing too. So I think that's where I got started on the collaborative side of the conservation field in DC.
Does it matter when you're dealing with, or how do you feel about, like, back then you would have been dealing with much larger budget, more available resources.
Yep.
You're in a smaller town here. How does that change the dynamic?
Well, as I like to say, the closer you get to the ground, the more complicated things get. So it was actually, with a $70 million budget or whatever, I think that was it when I left, and working in Washington, D.C. and traveling abroad, you're working at a pretty conceptual level. And you're making arguments, you're creating strategies, you're helping governments develop policies, but you're at a pretty high altitude. And so in some ways, it's easier. It's often harder to measure your progress in a country in which you don't really have a whole lot of control. But I think the work itself is more conceptual by nature. The closer you get to the ground, now you're into local politics. And in water, as we know, there's hardly anything as complicated and potentially divisive as that. So what I found is going from a $70 million budget to, I think the biggest budget I managed at the DRC was around $6 million. It was every bit as hard, probably a lot harder, just because of all the local factors that one has to take into consideration to get real conservation results on the ground.
Yeah, that's somewhat of the same thing I tell people who are coming to do journalism here in Central Oregon as they move from a big city where politics and journalism's very personal here. You're going to meet the person you wrote about. You're not going to be able to stay in your ivory tower. So
Exactly. Very true.
So the Wickiup Dam has been very prevalent with regard to its current state and the drought we're in, and images of that thing have been incredible to see, especially if you've lived here a long time and you've watched it degrade to the point where it's at. Can you describe how the flows are the Wickiup are managed, and give people some insight as to, a jumping off here of like, how do we arrive at something like this? It looks like a river now. It looks like probably like it used to.
Yes. Okay. I'll see if I can make this as simple as possible. Let's just start with there's 6 irrigation districts that divert from the Deschutes River. They divert what we call natural flow, and they divert stored water that is stored in one of 3 reservoirs: Crane Prairie, Wickiup, and Crescent. And so that essentially, by around the turn of the 20th century, we had appropriated all of the water in the winter or the summer, because the stored water, of course, is stored in the winter. It captures the winter water. And in the summer, you're getting the water rights that are flowing in the river naturally. So the problem actually started 120 years ago when we massively overappropriated the resource. And by that, I mean that at any one time in the summer, particularly in the hot summer months, there are far more water rights that were issued by the state of Oregon for irrigators to divert from the river than there's actually water in the river. And they are that organized along a very, a priority system that maybe we'll get into a little bit later. So the way it works is and we're about to have this, we're in the middle of October, the irrigators will begin to turn off. And then starting November, we essentially turn off much of the river at the top and store water in those reservoirs. So that creates a very big problem below those dams, wherever they occur. And then in April, we open the gates, and now we close off the river below the irrigation diversions. So we release water from the reservoirs. We use the rivers to transport the water to the diversions. We divert virtually all the water from the river. It's about 90% of the water from the river into these large canals. And we create the same problem that we created below the dams in the winter. Now we've created in the summer below the diversions. As I like to say, every year is a drought year below an irrigation diversion, because we've basically taken 90% of the water. So this is all according to state law, but it's very complicated because you have 6 different districts all competing for the water. And so what you have now, how Wickiup can get into this situation, is we've had drought, we have species issues. We have both bull trout that are threatened, Oregon spotted frog, we have mid-Columbia steelhead. So as the conditions in our rivers have degraded, we've created more threatened or endangered species with which the irrigators have to be concerned. It's driven by their own actions of, as I just explained, taking virtually all the water out of the river. And now this is exacerbated by a 10-year trend of drought, which we all believe is climate change that we're experiencing today. So you've got these 2 factors, species and climate, driving change. But this summer was a really good example, because if you've got 6 districts all competing for water, none of them want to take any less, and they're actually all trying to get as much of it as they can. It's that.
Well, and Todd, isn't it? I mean, the priorities for the water, I mean, they were established hundreds of years ago, or
right at 1900. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
And so they don't take into account they're not flexible in that things have changed. And what's the chance that there is any kind of negotiation on that? How strict are those laws from 100 years ago.
Well, they have shown very little interest in really negotiating. What they have said is, come build us big projects, mainly piping main canals with public money, and we will do some restoration work. And because that's the form of conservation that we accept. And those types of projects actually don't affect the underlying water rights. So they will do business with you if you really don't touch the water rights and allow them to be delivered as they were 120 years ago.
So
it's really that lack of flexibility and now sort of the sense of there's a scarce resource and we've got 6 different entities kind of all vying for it. No, the answer is that those 6 districts actually come together and say, we've got change. How do we manage the change? How do we share water differently among these different priority dates? And how do we also improve our infrastructure? Because some of those canal piping projects are actually quite good, but they can't be done and they can't serve as the only way in which we can serve water and move water around the basin to meet all these new needs. And frankly, growing cities are a need too. I mean, we don't necessarily like to see all this growth, but it's here and cities have to have water too.
Sure.
So you've been really critical of the hobby farm industry. Can you talk a little bit about, the difference between having a lifestyle farm and a commercial farm, and how this plays into the conversation about these historical water rights?
That's a great question. So it's hobby. It's not necessarily just hobby farmers versus commercial farmers. It's senior water right holders versus junior water right holders. Now, those two things happen to align that our biggest commercial farmers are in the Culver Madras area, and they have the most junior water rights. And those who hold the most senior water rights, the largest of which is Central Oregon Irrigation District. In their district, and I heard their manager the other day say, I've got a third of my patrons watering grass. I've got a third of them in sort of 4-H clubs, small, very small, onesie twosie, up to 10 acres of rural lifestyle farming. And then I've got a third that's in probably commercial, much more grazing, cattle production, and maybe a few crops, but there's hardly any crops being grown in the Central Oregon Irrigation District. So if you take that at its face value, you've got 2/3 of the water that's being diverted by a very senior water right holder that's going to what we might say is a less valuable form of agriculture, not food production, and not really economic. In Deschutes County, there's negative $25 million a year produced in agriculture. So it tells you we're not really in the business of producing products and crops in Deschutes County in particular, because it's really dominated by lifestyle farms. So I don't begrudge the lifestyle farms. In fact, we love the open space. We'd rather see a lifestyle farm than a bunch of condominiums, right? Or a destination resort.
Well, and Tod, alpacas are very cute.
Yeah.
They're just endearing animals to see out there.
Right. The problem is the senior water right doesn't create any incentive for those folks to actually use their water more judiciously. They've never had to. For 120 years, they turn on the spigot in April, the water flows, they get the water kind of no matter how bad their infrastructure is, or no matter what their irrigation methods are, COAD doesn't run out of water. So it's hard to convince them with a system like that why they should change, because that costs money, right? So,
well, and I don't think people understand that when we talk about delivery methods, like for commercial farms, a lot of them they're running very efficient drip irrigations. They're, like you said, they're junior water right. But here in many places, they're still flood irrigating. They're still opening the pipe and letting it run over every square inch of the land.
Exactly. I believe the numbers are 25% of Central Oregon Irrigation District is still flood irrigated. And that's a district of over 50,000 acres. So do the math. It's a lot of acreage, just water flowing over the landscape. So it's really, really very inefficient. And they would say we are entitled to use their water that way. And I say, no, you're not. It's wasteful. You should the law says you have to put your water to beneficial use without waste. That doesn't mean putting the maximum amount of water that you're entitled to on the land. It means putting the appropriate amount of water on the land for what it is that you're growing. But there's really so little regulation or enforcement of any of this kind of rule or regulation or statute in the state. And that's created this dynamic of the haves and the have-nots. So to your point, the haves, a bunch of them are the hobby farmers. All we want them to do is use less water, not take all their water away. We'd like them to stay rural. We don't begrudge their lifestyle at all. It's just invest in their properties to use the water more efficiently.
Well, go ahead, Laurel.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, aren't they disincentivized really to save water? Don't they lose out if they use less than the year before, the way it's set up now?
They theoretically they could. Okay, so there is this: if you don't put your water to use for 5 consecutive years, you're subject to forfeiture of the water right. So first, in practice, it's hardly ever regulated. It's a complaint-driven system. Water Resources isn't really set up to actually do any of that. And actually, in the late 90s, there was an amendment to that, which basically to try to get around that, which says no, you can use less water and not lose your water right. So that's the provision that we really want to emphasize. Is if you have a 5 acre-feet per acre water right, which means you can put a 5 feet of standing water on an acre. That's the volume of water if you can visualize that. You don't have to use all that water. You could use 1 or 2, 2.5, and you're not going to lose your water right. That's what we're trying to get them to do. And we actually believe, since the incentives are so backwards, since they have are perverse because of their senior water right, that it'll take some incentives. So we'd like to create a water bank that offers them, that says, well, if we paid you to lose less water, would you do that? And all the recent studies, including the one that was just completed by the irrigators themselves, demonstrates that irrigators would use less water in an incentive-based system. So all we got to do is get that water bank back going, and it'll make a huge difference in how we conserve and use our water in the basin.
Todd, one of the things, obviously, that's a big part of the river landscape right now, especially when it comes to irrigators, is piping of the canals.
Right.
And I think there's been, as they're investing more of taxpayer dollars into these type of projects, it feels to me like there is a greater awareness in the general community now of what it means to be doing this, to be investing in these canals and piping. Prior to some of these larger piping projects, it seemed like, well, this is a small group of NIMBYs who are losing canal water in their backyard, and why do we care? And now that the price tag is starting to crest, quarter, 25 million, 30 million, go upwards, I feel like people are paying more attention. And what are your thoughts about the economic versus the environmental base for these projects?
So the infrastructure in these districts is 120 years old. It does need to be upgraded, right? So I think that's a basic understanding we need to all have. But the question is, how do we spend the scarce resources that we have when we have a very urgent problem? We just talked about climate change and species. So I've had conversations with the manager saying, it's great that you have an improvement plan. It's wonderful that you have an infrastructure improvement plan. You needed to do that a long time ago. It's great you have it now. It could take you 50 years. Maybe it's your next 100-year plan. That's great, because there are great benefits to them managing that water more efficiently with much less seepage loss and just greater efficiency on the delivery side. And it will also help us to use our incentives and our water banking more effectively, because in a leaky system, it's hard for the water to carry to the end if they're leaking a lot of water in transmission. So what I've argued for is a smart, sort of integrated form of this, where you look out and you see where can we get sort of the most bang for our buck, and let's do some cost-effective infrastructure development, and let's do some water marketing and some on-farm conservation as well. And I think my gripe and my beef today is that the districts are putting really all of their eggs in the large canal piping basket. And they're just barely starting. If you go to them, they'll say, well, we're doing that, we're doing that. It's just barely starting to get a foothold in the districts to think more about on-farm conservation and water marketing. And those two should be leading the way so that we can actually have answers in the next decade that will be meaningful for the river.
Todd, do you feel like with those kind of federal dollars that you could incentivize or even pay for local farmers within the districts to give up their water right or go to a system within their property that might otherwise have the same amount of water value or economic value?
So there's a broad set of funders. I don't know that, and so when you go to NRCS, which is the federal agency that's now working with this Public Law 566 that Merkley helped establish, it's an old law that he helped get some authorization for new funding into. Then they have to do a watershed plan, which with NRCS, that dictates the scope and what can happen. So had they argued to make that broader, we would have had a bunch more tools in the tool chest that federal money could have been used for. But they made their arguments very narrowly around main canal piping, essentially saying this is what we control, this is what we can do, et cetera, et cetera. So there are other forms of funding that can fund water marketing. And there's plenty of funding in the Farm Bill every year for on-farm work.
Right.
So it's just a matter of where there's a will, there's a way, and getting people to really focus on it and have a strategy, and then using our congressional delegation to go get those dollars and use them in the most cost-effective way. The water marketing is from the Deschutes Basin study analyzed the different conservation approaches. And water marking was 1/10 of the cost of large canal piping. So wow. Again, you just have to, all of them need to be in the mix. It is a complicated topic, but we really need to greatly encourage and emphasize the movement of water from district to district and in stream through financial incentives.
Todd, can you tell us about your new role with Central Oregon LandWatch and how that's different from what you were doing with the Deschutes River Conservancy?
Yes, I can. So as you know, the Central Oregon LandWatch is an advocacy organization. It's really one of the few in Central Oregon that's really just focused on Central Oregon advocacy issues from both land and water. There's others more regionally or in Eastern Oregon, but we're pretty focused right here. And what's been very refreshing is that I can, instead of having to think about or try to represent the multiple interests that were on my board of directors at the Deschutes River Conservancy, now I can just focus on what the river needs, and we can really start to speak for the river and the fish and wildlife and all the aquatic species and that whole ecosystem. And it's important to have that freedom, because when you're on a board with all of those interests there, if you take only the river's interest point of view, you're going to get a lot of pushback from the other interests. And that organization is a great one, and they do good work, and there's a lot of great projects to be done in cooperation with the districts. In fact, like a water bank, we're not going to do one of those unless we have an organization that's positioned to work with them to actually execute that. But my role is really to argue for those policies that kind of change and to make the public more aware of what can actually happen, because this is such a complicated field. A lot of people have, are kind of mystified about water management, and what can we actually expect to see, and what can we expect the districts to actually do, since, as I explained at the beginning, they control all the water rights, all the winter rights and all the summer rights. You got all roads stop there at their boards.
And so, Todd, maybe that's a good segue to talk about the Deschutes Basin Habitat Conservation Plan. Could you just give us an overview of what that is? I know it's going to be coming out in November.
Yeah.
Maybe talk to that a little bit.
So 11 or 12 years ago, when Mid-Columbia Steelhead were reintroduced above the Pelton hydroelectric project down at Lake Billy Chinook, and that was done under negotiation for that relicensing of those dams, and at great interest of PG&E and the tribes. The districts all of a sudden realized that they had a potential problem. And so they and their attorneys started the long process of applying to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, for incidental take permits. If in the lawful execution of their business, they incidentally take one of these species, they want to be protected from it. So that's what that is. And so what the process is they apply to the government for the permit, and they write the plan. A lot of people think that this is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife plan. It's not. It's a district and the district's consultants' plan. They say, we want you to give us a permit, and in return, we're going to mitigate our effects on, and now it's the important species are the Oregon spotted frog, Mid-Columbia steelhead, and bull trout. And so they have spent a very long time trying to put a plan together that would be satisfactory for the government to say, yes, I'll permit that. And these permits can be, I think they asked originally for a 50-year one. I believe they're talking about a 30-year now. So the conditions under which that ultimately gets negotiated and permanent will have a long-standing effect on how the river gets managed over the next several decades. And so that's what's going on now. They've produced a draft. There was public comment last year. The final drafts in the environmental impact statement will be coming out on November 6th.
And what do you think the impact of that survey is going to be for the region? I mean, what's your initial critique, premonition? I mean, we're not placing bets here or anything, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen of the first draft and other conversations, I just think it's going to fall very much short of any significant real mitigation for the species that they're getting covered for in the permit. And so particularly the ones that we were looking at were Chinook and steelhead. Well, they removed Chinook from the permitting, decided not to get it covered. I think it was probably too hard for them to figure out how to mitigate their impacts on it. But if you look at the life cycle histories, the biology of these fish and frogs, and then you look at what the flow needs and the habitat needs and the water temperature needs are for these species, and then you look at what the irrigators are proposing in their habitat conservation plan, there's a huge divide there. So I don't expect that they will have closed that gap from what we saw in their draft a year ago substantially. I think there has been something, that's what I've heard. We'll see in a couple of weeks. But I suspect if you really just look at, have they done what those iconic fish species need in our region for their biology and their basic needs, the answer will be no.
So Todd, if I'm thinking back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast about the senior rights and the junior rights and the push and pull of these things, if there is not enough water allocated for these species, which it sounds like that's going to continue to be a problem, especially if global warming continues to shrink the amount of available water, then where do they go to make these concessions? Where will they? I mean, if the water right seems to be somewhat intractable, then how do they extricate themselves from these obligations?
Well, so what they do is what we've already talked about. If you think, what did I just say? There's 2/3 of a district that's 50,000 acres is in hobby farm or growing grass. If they dramatically reduce their water use through incentives, all of that water, a big portion of that water can go to the farmers in North Unit, and then that obviates the need for stored water in Wickiup. We can actually store more there, and then we can release it as we need it for fish and wildlife. And so there is a problem of scale. This has to be done at a big enough scale, sharing, senior water right holders sharing through incentives, they get paid, with the juniors, who are the primary crop growers in our region and the drivers of our agricultural economy. And then in turn, those growers in North Unit Irrigation District give up some of their storage for fish and wildlife. Particularly, this will solve or go a long way to ameliorating the problems for the Oregon spotted frog in the upper Deschutes River. So we believe there really is enough water. I mean, it's challenging. It's really a matter of using it more wisely, getting rid of flood irrigation, using less water, and reallocating the resource to the places that it now needs to be in the 21st century, which is more water for real farms and for fish and wildlife in the Deschutes.
Let me just throw a what if out there. What if, or is it possible that through piping, through these dollars that will be invested in piping these canals, and it seems like that train is heading down the tracks, will they reclaim enough water from that project to satisfy the restrictions they're going to feel in the Deschutes Basin Conservation Plan?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the reasons they're not offering very much water in total and very quickly is because they say they can't. And they say they can't because they can't get the money for these massive federal projects. I'm saying, well, no, for 1/10 of the cost, you can develop and implement a water bank here that will make a huge difference in the next decade, and then keep the piping going as you can get those resources in line. But now you will have averaged the cost of this conservation. You will have driven the cost way down, and you will have generated a lot more water a lot quicker. So that's what we're arguing: more water quicker than you're proposing in the plan. And you're saying you can't. The irrigators are saying we can't do more, but they're just hanging their hat mostly on that big pipe solution, which is so expensive. So that's what I'm trying to, my hope is that they can really develop an integrated strategy that would actually work in the near term.
Laurel, did you have a final question?
Oh, I was just going to ask, what is going to happen? So their proposal, the irrigation districts are going to throw out their proposals, and the most important, like the critical time, is after that comes out and everyone makes their objections. What happens then? Like what could really stop them in their tracks from getting the go ahead to just extricate species till the end of time without getting sued?
Well, that's a good question. We don't really know what our response or others. We're not the only organization that's looking at it, but clearly, the last recourse is legal action. If you just look at the Columbia River today, for the last 20 years, the biological opinions that have been put forward by the federal government to mitigate the harm to salmon species with the federal dams there has been in litigation, and it's been ongoing. And I really hope that we don't get into that kind of interminable litigation. But what I do hope is that there's enough of us who stand up and just say this isn't okay, and that we somehow can get at a settlement table that would enable us to find some path forward that's a lot better than the one they will put on the table next month.
Todd, we've just got a couple minutes left before the end of the podcast. Is there anything you'd like to say about the basin that we haven't touched on?
Only that people lose sight of the fact that the Deschutes River is like the biggest spring-fed river in the United States. This is a national treasure. We're not talking about just any river. And it happens to be in our backyard. And sometimes I think we take for granted the resources that are right around us. This is a very, very unique and special resource. And to have that spring water, it's very cold, it's very clean. It's really an amazing resource. And it's really one of the reasons why I fell in love with it and why I want to defend it today.
Well, Todd, thank you for spending this time with us. Water issues are, Laurel and I commiserate about this all the time. They're one of the hardest issues that, especially as journalists, we try to wrap our heads around. And I think you've done an excellent job of getting us into the issue pretty smartly. So,
well, thank you very much for engaging in this topic. It is a difficult one. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
This has been the Bend Don't Break podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next week.